Hello, friends, and let's get started.
Nick buttoned the last button of his shirt and looked at himself in the mirror. In the reflection was a confident man in an expensive navy blue jacket, with a slight shadow of stubble emphasizing the hard line of his chin. It was just right. He ran his palm through his hair, smoothing it down, and leaned over to the sink to splash cold water on his face. It was going to be a long evening, but a pleasant one. After all, events like this didn't happen every day. His friend Chris had finally gotten the promotion he'd been seeking for years and was throwing a party at his country home. Nick knew this celebration would be a raucous one, filled with booze, laughter, and talk of old times. About how they'd started out, how they'd lived on student scholarships alone, dreaming of one day becoming something big. Now Chris had his own office at the company, a sizable bank account, and of course, a reason for a good celebration. Megan should have been there by now. She'd said she'd go early to help with the preparations. Nick didn't mind. He knew how she loved such evenings, how she loved to fuss, to decorate, to set the atmosphere. For her, organizing any event was a ritual. That was her strength. He smiled, remembering how she told him last night what the night should be like. Easy, fun, no stress, no formalities. You just don't be late, she said, laughing when he jokingly rolled his eyes in response to her instruction. He pulled out his phone, glanced at the screen. No new messages. The time was 8:45. She was definitely already there. He needed to get on the road. Taking his wristwatch from the dresser, Nick quickly buckled the strap and headed for the hallway. But barely as he stepped beyond the threshold of the bedroom, a strange feeling slowed him down. Something was wrong. He couldn't immediately grasp what it was. Just a brief, almost gut feeling, as if something unpleasant hung in the air. He stopped, frowned, ran through his memory of their last conversation. It had seemed like business as usual. But no, not really. Her voice, something in her tone, in the overly hasty, "I'll be there early, I'll see you later," in a way she hadn't asked what time he'd be there, even though she usually always specified. But what really hurt him was that she hadn't written a word all day. She hadn't asked when he was leaving, hadn't asked if he'd picked up a present for Chris. She hadn't even texted the usual photo of the party already in progress. Megan loved sharing details. It wasn't her style to just disappear. Nick opened his phone, opened their correspondence. The last message was her short, "I'm on my way," around 5 p.m. He swiped his finger down, wondering if he should text, but dismissed the thought himself. Nonsense. She's at a party, busy doing things, probably surrounded by her friends, making toasts, laughing. It's all normal. Nick wasn't a man prone to anxiety attacks. He didn't get jealous of Megan for no reason, didn't pry in her phone, didn't make meaningless guesses. But now, standing in the semi-dark hallway of his house, he suddenly caught himself thinking that the silence from his wife was too deafening. He took a deep breath. There was no time left for reflection. He moved out to the car, got behind the wheel, started the engine. It was already dark outside. The asphalt glistened under the light of the street lamps. The air was cool and fresh. Nick headed toward Chris's house, but thoughts of his wife wouldn't leave him. Something was wrong. But what? When Nick pulled up to Chris's house, the party was already in full swing. His friend's two-story mansion was ablaze with lights. The music was blaring even through the closed car windows, and there were so many cars in the driveway that he had to park a little farther down the street. Nick turned off the engine and paused for a second, looking at the front of the house. He expected to see Megan right away, maybe on the porch, in the company of her friends, a glass of wine in her hands. But she wasn't there. That was odd. She always liked to greet guests, make sure everything went perfectly. He got out of the car, closed the door, and headed toward the house. The air smelled of alcohol, sweet tobacco smoke, and freshly cut grass. It was noisy inside. Laughter, voices, music, the whole mixture hit his ears as soon as he stepped over the threshold. Someone clapped him on the shoulder, someone shouted his name, offering him a drink, but Nick only nodded in response, making his way through the crowd. He looked around for his wife. She was nowhere to be found. He caught a glimpse of Chris, who was standing at the bar with a glass of whiskey. He raised his hand in greeting and smiled. "You're finally here? Where have you been?" Chris shouted, blocking out the music. Nick approached, gritting his teeth. "Where's Megan?" Chris frowned, took a sip, and shrugged. She gotten here early, hadn't she? She's got to be around here somewhere. You haven't seen her? No, Nick answered sharply. He felt something inside him vibrate unpleasantly. Chris looked at him more closely, as if assessing his expression, then waved his hand, distracted by someone else. Nick moved on. The living room was full of people, Chris's co-workers, his friends, some unfamiliar faces. Women in smart dresses, men with relaxed smiles, someone with a glass, someone with a cigarette. Everywhere, laughter, merriment. But there was no Megan among them. He walked over to a group of people sitting on a leather couch by the fireplace. Among them was Sarah, Megan's friend. She was laughing, discussing something with the other girls, but when she saw Nick, the smile on her face faded slightly. "Hi," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Have you seen Megan?" Sarah blinked, then frowned slightly. "Oh, I've seen her before," she said, looking around the room thoughtfully. "Probably around here somewhere. Maybe in the kitchen?" "Maybe," Nick answered dryly. He knew she wasn't in the kitchen. He had just walked past it. He continued walking through the house, trying not to show the tension building up inside. The second floor was mostly closed off. The bedrooms were there, and guests didn't go up there. But something inside told him that was where he should look. He approached the stairs, but at that moment someone called out to him. "Nick!" The voice was muffled, as if the man didn't want to attract attention. He turned around. It was Todd, one of Chris's buddies. A guy Nick wasn't particularly close to, but had seen at a few events like this. Todd looked odd. He had a bottle of beer in his hands, but he wasn't drinking, just squeezing the neck with his fingers as if trying to keep his hands busy. His gaze was intense, too attentive. "Megan," he started, and then he stammered, running his hand over the back of his head, as if he didn't know how best to say it. Nick stepped closer, no longer hiding his irritation. "What? Where is she?" Todd swallowed, then nodded slightly toward the stairs. "Maybe you should go upstairs." Those words, so simple, sounded like something much heavier. They sounded like there was something behind them that Todd himself didn't want to voice. Nick felt something cold clench in his chest. His heart beat faster, and a familiar feeling of unease stirred in his stomach. "What's in there?" he asked, looking at him carefully. Todd looked away, pretending to look toward the bar. "Just, you'd better see for yourself." Nick didn't answer. He turned around slowly, heading for the stairs, and with each step he felt that icy noose clenching tighter and tighter inside. He didn't need words to realize there was something ahead of him that he wasn't ready to see. Nick climbed the stairs, the suffocating pressure building in his chest, and his heart thudding in his ribs as if warning him to stop. But he didn't stop. Halfway up the stairs, he froze. A sound came to him. Laughter. Muffled female warm. And right behind it, a man's voice, also muffled, but too close. Nick stood still, listening as the laughter faded into a quiet, whispered conversation. The words were unintelligible, but the intonation was all too clear. This was not the conversation of friends. It was the voice of a man who felt at ease. The voice of a woman who felt no anxiety. There was no rush in it, no fear of being caught. He didn't bother to knock. He jerked the door sharply toward him, with a force that made it slam against the wall. The world froze. For an infinitely long second. On the bed, in the soft light of the bedside lamp, lay Megan, in just her underwear. Her blonde hair disheveled, her eyes dilated, her face pale. A man stood beside her, tall, dark-haired, naked to the waist. He was already buckling his belt, and his shirt was crumpled as if it had just been ripped off. The room smelled of Megan's perfume, alcohol, and something else. Nick stood on the threshold, looking at them, and his breathing became heavy, ragged. He saw them, frozen pale, afraid. But that fear only appeared the moment the door opened. They hadn't been afraid before. They had felt no danger. Only now, only in front of him. He heard his own voice, but he didn't recognize it. It wasn't just a scream. It was a roar, spilling out of the depths of his chest. What the fuck is going on here? The music downstairs faded for a split second. Someone must have heard his scream, but he didn't care. Nick took a step forward, with that picture still in his mind's eye. Megan, Justin, their bodies, their poses. He could feel something inside him breaking, crumbling, but the rage overrode everything. His hands shook with tension, He clenched his fists so hard his nails dug into his palms. Megan opened her mouth, but couldn't say anything. Her chest heaving with bated breath. Her eyes ran from him to Justin, as if she was trying to find salvation in something that didn't exist. Justin raised his hand slowly, as if hoping to smooth things over. "Look, Nick, this isn't what you—" "Don't you dare," Nick shouted, stepping toward him. Anger was pounding in his temples, his blood boiling. "Don't you dare, you bastard. Tell me that's not what I think it is." Justin took a step back, but there was only a wall behind him. He opened his mouth but didn't have time to say a word. Nick grabbed him by the collar of his shirt and yanked him toward him, feeling the built-up tension explode in his body. The first blow hit him in the jaw. His knuckles flared with pain, but he didn't stop. Justin collapsed against the wall, the lamp on the nightstand falling from the impact, the lights going out. "Nick, stop!" Megan shouted, but her voice was distant, as if it didn't exist. Justin wiped his busted lip, looked at the blood on his fingers. "Damn it, man, will you calm down?" he tried to say, but Nick wasn't listening. He grabbed him by the shoulder and pushed him against the wall, hitting him again. There was the sound of meat hitting bone. Justin groaned, grabbing his stomach. Justin tried to break free, but Nick held him tight, pressing his fist into the floor. Justin's face was already showing red stains from the blows. His lip was smashed, blood was slowly dripping down his chin, leaving dark stains on his crumpled shirt. He tried to reach for Nick to shove him, but he sharply knocked his arm away, then piled on top of him, driving his knee into his chest. "Did you think I wouldn't recognize that, you scum?" Nick roared, squeezing his collar so hard the fabric crackled. "Did you think I was going to watch you do it?" Justin coughed, gulping for air, but Nick didn't give him a chance to respond. Another blow, a powerful straight punch to the stomach. Justin's body twisted in pain, the air escaping from his lungs with a short, stifled sob. He was writhing, wriggling, trying to push Nick away, but the man's weight was on top of him, keeping him up. "Stop, Nick," Justin wheezed, but his voice was drowned in the rage that boiled in Nick's blood. He could no longer hear anything but his own frantic pulse in his ears. Every blow seemed insufficient. Each blow wasn't enough. Wanted to smash his face so that he could never look at anyone with that cocky grin again. I wanted him to feel all the pain that was tearing him apart. "Nick, stop!" Megan's voice cut across his ears, piercing his consciousness, but not loosening his grip. It was a mistake. It was nothing. Her words flashed through his mind like gunpowder. A mistake? A mistake? It wasn't a mistake. Mistakes are when you accidentally drop a glass, forget to lock the door, lose your phone. Mistakes don't happen in the semi-darkness of a bedroom, in the rumpled sheets, among the clothes strewn carelessly across the floor. Nick abruptly let go of Justin, letting him cough and curl up, holding his stomach. He rose slowly, catching his breath, turning around to his wife. She stood, barefoot, half-dressed, her hair disheveled, her eyes glistening with tears. He looked at her and felt the rage explode inside again. Meaningless? His voice shook the walls. He took a step toward her, and she instinctively backed away. "Are you a slut? Are you mocking me?" He grabbed the nearest chair and threw it against the wall with force. The wood cracked, and the furniture collapsed onto its side, hitting the floor with a clatter. Megan flinched and pressed her palms to her lips, her eyes rounded with fear. "You say it was nothing," Nick continued, keeping his gaze on her with no warmth left in it. "You fucked him in front of me at my friend's house, and you're telling me it was just a mistake." Megan blinked often, tears filling her eyes, but she took a step forward, extending her hand toward him as if hoping that one touch could stop him. "Nick, please." Her voice trembled, her lips white with tension. "It's not what you think. It doesn't mean I don't love you. Don't you dare say that to me." He shouted in a way that made her recoil. "You better shut up, Megan." She froze, her breathing hitching. Justin, meanwhile, groaned and lifted himself up, but as soon as he moved, Nick rushed over to him, grabbed him by the collar of his shirt, and yanked him upward, pinning him back against the wall. "Are you still here?" His voice trailed off into a hoarse growl. "You think I'm going to let you just walk away?" Justin threw up his hands and coughed, his eyes filled with panic. "Dude, I'm sorry, really. he squeezed out, but Nick only squeezed his throat harder. Sorry? He grinned, feeling every nerve in his body burn with hatred. You're sorry? He swung, ready to strike again, but at that moment someone yanked him by the arm. Nick, stop it! Megan shouted, clawing at him from behind, trying to hold him back. You're going to kill him. He stiffened. His chest heaved, his fingers clenching and unclenching. Justin jerked, but Nick released him so sharply that he collapsed to the floor with a thud. Dead silence hung in the room, only their heavy breathing filling the space. Nick looked at his wife. I hate you, Megan, he said finally. His voice was hollow. You're nothing to me. She aghast, nearly falling over at those words, but he didn't look to see how she would react. He turned and left the room without looking back. In the morning, the suitcase stood by the door, neatly buttoned, its handle slightly taut, as if it had been reluctantly set down. Beside him, squaring his shoulders, stood Megan. Her fingers clutched the edge of her sweater sleeve, as if she were trying to keep herself from grabbing for something more tangible, something that might save her. Her eyes were wide open, filled with something that might have seemed like fear. But Nick knew it wasn't fear. It was doom. He stood across the room, leaning against the door jamb, arms crossed over his chest. He felt nothing. No anger, no regret. There wasn't even fatigue. Just emptiness. Like he'd been scorched from the inside out, and now all that was left of him was a shell. He stared at her, not a single thought in his head. Everything had already been said. Everything had already been lived. All that was left was this, the cold end. Megan swallowed, her lips trembling. She opened her mouth, but froze without uttering a word. She blinked a few times, looked down, then back up at him. I'm leaving. Her voice was thin, almost a whisper. Nick remained silent. She took a breath, rocked forward a little, as if she expected a reaction from him, but there was none. He just stared. You, she started, but froze. She ran her palm over his cheek, inhaled deeply. Do you really want me to leave? He grinned, briefly, almost silently. He looked at her as if she'd just asked him what color the sky was today. Roll. Her face twitched as if he'd slapped her. For a split second she was short of breath, but she didn't back down. She stood in front of him, with that desperate expression on her face, with the suitcase at her feet, with those hands shaking and clenching into fists. Nick, there was something like a plea in her voice. She stepped closer, but he didn't move. He didn't even change his face. She waited, waiting for some sign that he would change his mind, that he'd back off, that he'd give her a chance to say something else, maybe even say goodbye in a different way. But he was no longer the man to give her a chance for an excuse. Nick slowly raised his hand and slammed the door shut. A muffled sound blocked her exhale. That was it. He stayed in the darkness of the hallway, staring at that very door, and felt nothing. Absolutely nothing. Nick woke up early. Too early, as in too early for someone who didn't need to rush anywhere else. For the first few days after Megan left, he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling until the gray light of the morning sky turned blindingly white. Then he simply stopped sleeping. Sleepless nights were replaced by running, by physical fatigue, by aching muscles, by a pulse that beat as frantically as it had then in that room. In that house, every morning began with a cold shower and scalding hot coffee. Then he'd go outside, pull up his hoodie, and run. Just run. At first without purpose, just running away from something invisible, but too close. But then running became meaningful. It became a ritual. For the first month, Nick ran 10 miles every morning. The pain in his legs, in his chest, in his lungs, all of that was nothing compared to what was eating him up from the inside out. So he kept running until the feeling started to dull. He stopped answering his friends' calls. Chris texted him, offering him a drink, telling him it would all go away, but Nick left messages unanswered. He didn't want to talk. He didn't want to discuss. He just wanted to move, wanted to feel that his body was still working, that his heart wasn't still beating just to be broken. The gym became his second apartment. The iron, the punching bags, the treadmill, it gave him something he couldn't get in anything else. Control. The most important resource he'd lost that night. The night he saw Megan with Justin. The second his life fell apart. Now he had control over at least that. The pain in his muscles, the strength of his kick, the speed of his run. 2 months passed. One evening he came home after a run. The apartment was filled with the smell of coffee and the fresh air he'd let in by leaving the windows open. He took off his wet t-shirt, tossed it in the laundry basket, and headed for the shower. The warm water ran down his skin, washing away the sweat, but not washing away his thoughts. The mirror reflected a different man. Not the same one as before. This one was sharper, harder, his eyes not looking to anyone for salvation. The next day, he went out jogging again. The morning park was deserted. The air smelled of fall. The run was easy, the movements honed like machinery. He ran his usual route, and only then did he notice her. She was sitting on a bench, her long brown hair gathered into a low ponytail. A book in her hands, but her gaze followed him. Not intrusive, not curious, just calmly. She watched him run past, and when their gazes met, the corners of her lips trembled in a slight smile. The next day, he saw her again, at the same hour, on the same bench. And the next day, after a week, he stopped pretending not to notice her. "You often run like you want to kill someone," she said one day when he stopped at a drinking fountain nearby. Her voice was light, without judgment, with a hint of playfulness. Nick turned his head and met her gaze. There was no pity in her eyes. It wasn't the expression he hated so much on his friends' faces when they looked at him after everything that had happened. "I used to want to," he replied, leaning over to take a sip of water. She didn't look away. "And now?" Nick looked at the road in front of him. He reached up and ran his fingers down the back of his neck, brushing away the sweat-damp hair. Took a deep breath. Just running now. And for the first time in a long time, he felt it was true. Nick didn't know what awaited him next. He was just living, without plans, without trying to fix anything, without illusions. He lived as best he could day by day, mile by mile, blow by blow, until the past no longer defined his every move. Lily turned out not to be the one to try to heal his wounds. She didn't ask unnecessary questions, didn't question why he was looking at her like he'd never let himself be vulnerable again. She was just there, in the park, on the bench, in the casual conversations that gradually grew longer, warmer, closer. It had been 6 months since the night he'd closed the door in Megan's face. He'd never once regretted it. Then one day, he saw her. It was an accident. She was standing at the checkout counter at the supermarket, head down, tapping her fingernail on the phone, waiting her turn. Her hair was gathered into a high ponytail, wearing the very coat he'd once given her. He could have walked over, could have looked her in the eye, given her a chance to say what she probably still wanted to say. But he didn't. He just walked past without slowing his step. Megan didn't notice him. That night he ran again. But this time his legs didn't carry him away from something. They just propelled him forward. Lily was waiting for him at the fountain. "No murderous expression on your face today," she said, handing him a bottle of water. "No murderous mood today," he replied, taking the bottle. She smiled and took a seat on the bench, gesturing for him to sit next to her. Nick looked at the dark sky, breathed in the cool air, then sat down next to her, stretching his tired legs out in front of him. "So it's all behind you then?" she asked. Nick didn't answer right away. He'd been thinking about it for a long time. About what had been, about what had become, and about what would come next. "No," he said at last. "Just not ahead anymore." Lily nodded, as if she understood him without further ado. And for the first time in months, Nick felt truly free. And that's where today's story ends. Thank you for watching to the end. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like and comment. We'd love to discuss this story with you. See you in the next video.